as over the last few months, I've been involved in numerous conversations which inevitably turn to the coronavirus. And typically, one person would have heard this, and the other maybe heard this, and the third maybe saw something on TV. But the bottom line is there seems to be a distinct lack of facts in these conversations. So now that the vaccine rollout is upon us, I decided that it is time for us all to learn the facts about coronavirus and the vaccine rollout. And we're very excited because today we have with us the smartest guy in my high school class. And he also happens to be a longtime client of SBSB, Dr. Bruce Gellin, the president of global immunization at the Sabin Vaccine Institute. Welcome, Bruce.
And thanks a lot for doing this.
And on behalf of all of the clients of SBSB, Bruce, thank you for spending your time here with us today. Bruce has devoted much of his adult life to the topic of vaccines and pandemics. He spent a long career working with and for the Department of Health and Human Services. His jobs included Deputy Assistant Secretary for Health. He was also director of the National Vaccine Program Office at HHS. And Bruce, I hear you were instrumental in developing the National Vaccine Plan, our country's blueprint for vaccine and immunizations, right?
It's true. It's true.
But I have to tell you, the most important thing I've seen on your bio is that you were a guest on the Bill Nye, the Science Guy podcast. What was that like?
You know, it was. It felt like you were in a seminar with a professor and maybe an oral exam and a little bit of comedy, because I mean he does his homework, and it was a great conversation with a lot of unexpected questions that got us into areas that I hadn't expected.
Yes, yes. So the way it's going to work today is I'm going to ask Bruce a series of questions that I think are on our clients' minds. And then we are an investment firm. So I'm going to spend just a few minutes talking about the markets and how they view the vaccine rollout and a couple of important points in terms of our investments. And then we're going to turn it over to you. And so Darren has showed you how to ask questions. So please feel free as we go along to submit your questions. And Bruce will take hopefully 15 minutes or more at the end to try and address your direct questions. So before we start, what we'd like to do is ask some poll questions. Darren, first question. Have you received a COVID-19 vaccination? So just check the box and submit it, and we'll see how the results go. Okay, second question. Has anyone in your immediate family received a COVID-19 vaccine? And then lastly, who here has unsuccessfully tried to get a COVID-19 vaccination? So there we have it. 20% of us have received a COVID vaccination. That's actually higher than I thought, Bruce. But almost, what is that? 40% have had someone in their family. Very nice. Again, better than I would have expected. And only 38% have unsuccessfully tried to get a COVID-19 vaccination appointment. What do you think, Bruce? Does that sound about right to you?
Yeah, I think you have a bunch of resourceful people here. This is a lot harder to do than this would represent, which is driving everybody crazy. Hopefully that'll get sorted out, but none of us guessed that your group would be have gotten this far.
Yes, yes. Why don't we start with some safety questions? Because I know that is on folks' minds. You, of course, are very aware of the historic speed of the vaccine development. Does that cause you any concern? And the bottom line, are the vaccines safe?
Yeah, actually, before we start, I want to reframe a little bit at the top. this is titled What We Need to Know. I guess it's what we need to know now. And the point is that this is a rapidly changing situation. When Jimmy, you and I talked about this a few weeks ago, this mutant strain, the variants weren't really part of the environment. So only to say that I'm glad you're having this now. We'll have lots of questions about things, but there's a lot happening that I think is relevant for now, and we're going to watch things evolve over time. Safety is really critical. I mean, it's central to vaccine development because vaccines are given to people who are well to prevent something they might run into. The flip side of that is drugs, which have a different safety bar as far as what the profile is, because people are willing to put up with different kinds of side effects when they're treating something. So throughout the development of vaccines, safety is really an issue. This one, I think the concerns on this one were the speed, but the speed sort of infused by the political pressure. And that's what made everybody worry. And I actually give the FDA a lot of credit for putting the brakes on that enough to say, let's use our regular process to evaluate these vaccines. And that, I think, went a long way. These vaccines were developed at a remarkable pace. And I think that speaks a lot to, we're going to learn, I think that everyone's going to learn a new normal in a lot of ways. And I think this is one of them. But I think that one of the things, and there are more vaccines than we're now talking about Pfizer and Moderna. There are others in the pipeline at various stages. But all of them, including these, are based on a long experience of science and using this technology in a number of different ways. So I think that it's not as though this just started a year ago and voila, here we are, and these are out of the box. And I think the other part is the oversight that the FDA gives their own scientists, and then bring out a group of independent advisors who in public forum go through the data and kick the tires on that. So what came out of the clinical trials was actually remarkable in many ways, particularly in terms of the effectiveness, and people have read about that. These vaccines are as effective as almost any vaccine. So that was a big surprise. But the safety was scrutinized throughout the clinical trials, and essentially was similar to what you see in other vaccine developments. I was on a call with CDC earlier today where they're having the first discussion of what the experience is of the 25 million doses that have already been administered. And again, they're keeping an eye on this, and there are a number of systems in place that look at it. So safety through the development process, and safety once you use is scrutinized. And that's it. There are systems ongoing now to look for those. So the short story is these vaccines they perform like many vaccines do. There are, and for those who have already had their vaccines, there are side effects: sore arms, fatigue, muscle aches, headache, and all those. And the numbers are relatively high for this vaccine. It's called reactogenic. The second dose is probably a little bit more. So if you haven't had that second dose, people should be prepared for that. But those are transient, and we see those a lot. So I think that we're going to continue to look for that. There may be surprises, but there are good systems in place to keep an eye on it.
Well, that is encouraging for sure. Are there any specific physical conditions that you think might be more of a problem than others? I know one of our clients asked about a condition called transverse myelitis. Are there any specific conditions that should worry people?
Well, I think there are two parts to that question. I think that the question is, are there conditions that you might have for which a vaccine might not be recommended, or might have a different safety profile, versus some of the things that have surfaced in the process of doing the vaccine developments? I think that we're going to learn more about this, that the people who were excluded from the trials were children and pregnant women for the most part. And so we still have to learn about that. And the reason that they were excluded, pregnant women are usually never the first to do vaccine studies because they want to make sure that the vaccines are safe and effective before they begin to test them in pregnant women. That will happen next. There's nothing about this that would be particularly worrisome. Some vaccines, live virus vaccines, for example, might be a problem in pregnancy. These don't have this, but we're going to have to know the studies that we'll have to see the studies for sure.
Right.
But let me just get back to the transverse myelitis, since it was asked. So in the people have seen these. In the process of doing clinical trials, there were a few times when the studies were stopped. And that happens routinely in clinical trials when a group of independent people who monitor them are looking at all the information and say, well, something happened here, we want to take a look at it. And in that case, there was a case of transverse myelitis, which is an inflammation of the spinal cord that occurred after vaccination. So the reason there's a group of people who look at that to make sure that the study wouldn't go forward if that indeed is a problem. They investigated that, didn't feel that it was likely related to vaccine. The study went on and there were no other cases of that. The other piece that's gotten attention is anaphylaxis, which is a severe allergy. What I just heard earlier today from the CDC is while there have been incidents of this, they're really no higher than you would expect with other products. And the protocol in the clinics, which I'm sure all have seen, is that's why you have to wait 15 minutes or half an hour to make sure you don't experience one of these episodes, which can be handled, but the clinics now may have to make sure that they have those kind of medical procedures at hand.
Right. Well, thank you. You just made one SBSB client very happy.
How many more do you got?
Yeah, 1,100 more. So hopefully we can talk fast. And lastly, no differences that are material or worth talking about between Pfizer and Moderna in terms of side effects?
You know, it's interesting. I bet nobody can name a company that makes a flu vaccine, and probably most of these people get a flu vaccine. Now everybody
exactly.
And there you have it. That's a conversation you have all the time. Socially distanced, wearing a mask, but people have that all the time. These are they're identical platforms are called. They're produced in the same way. There are some differences between them, sort of molecularly, but essentially they're similar. They have a slightly different side effect profile, but as far as the local side effects, but essentially they're the same. They have the same performance as far as their effectiveness, the same range of side effects as well.
So then one of the key takeaways here is that the folks on this call are likely not going to have a choice as to which vaccine they get, but they shouldn't fret about that or worry about that. They're both effective. Take whatever you can get.
Your folks probably spend a lot of time focusing on numbers, and one of the vaccines was 95%, was 94.5%. Maybe someone's going to go for that one. It reminds me of people who say, well, I went on a diet, my cholesterol went from 139 to 137, and they think that they're magically cured. So these are really, they're really the same. I think the key, and it's worth just highlighting this, is that the studies are done in certain ways. And the studies are done with a specific dose and the interval between doses 1 and dose 2 at specific times. And the studies are done almost perfectly because they're studies. Real life doesn't always work that way. And then the question is, what if it's a little later? What if it's a little earlier, that second dose? I think that you should try as much as possible to stick to what the study was, because you know that can replicate what you'll experience. The question is going to be about second doses and interchangeability. Frankly, there's no information about it. If you get Pfizer first and Moderna second, or vice versa, those studies haven't been done. Because of the way the vaccines are made, it should be fine, but nobody knows. And now there's some discussion to CDC based on really expert opinion, this kind of opinion, that if that's what happens to you and you happen to get a different dose for the second one and the first one, I wouldn't fret about that either. You don't have to redo everything. That shouldn't happen with the way scheduling works, but it could happen because the supplies are so variable.
Okay, another encouraging note. You're racking them up here. Let's keep it going. I have some questions on the timing. And enrolling, as you started out, been really frustrating. Should we expect it to improve? When should the audience, as a general rule, expect to be eligible to be vaccinated? And then the last question is, when do you expect herd immunity? And while we're at it, what the heck is herd immunity?
Right. So let me start with that. And I think that's so the concept of herd immunity actually goes back 100 years, really, to measles. And 100 years ago, long before there was a vaccine, there were periodic outbreaks of measles, but then you wouldn't see measles for a couple of years, and then it would come back. No one was quite sure what that was it the virus changing or not? But what that was because measles is so contagious, if the virus is there, essentially everybody got infected. And if everybody's infected, the measles virus has no place to go. So for a couple of years, while the more people come into the community because they're born into the community, once you have enough people there for the virus to then find a group of people, it's like a spark in dry forest to take off, that's what happens. So that's really the concept, so it's based on watching that vacillation historically. There are all kinds of numbers that get calculated for this, but the short story is when there's enough immunity in the population, you heard the measles story, that comes from the natural infection from the virus, or now this is the immunity you get from either having had the COVID infection or having had the vaccine. When there's enough immunity in the population, the virus has a hard time finding other people to infect. What that number is based on a number of different things. It's based on the infectiousness of the virus. It's based on the mixing of the population. It's probably around 3/4 of the population in a community, if you will, that's needed for that virus to then have a hard time to find people. And again, it's a combination of immunity from the disease as well as the vaccine. There was an idea that was floated around was, well, maybe we should just get immunity by letting the virus do its thing. Well, that would work for the immunity standpoint, but that would come with a huge toll of morbidity and mortality. And people calculated the number of deaths that would occur if that was a strategy, which fortunately it wasn't. So as we look forward, I think it's going to be a combination of the immunity we get from ongoing disease and the immunity we get from the vaccine to get there. There are all kinds of projections on when that may occur, but it's obviously a combination of those two things of infection and vaccine. Yeah, it looks like the vaccine supply is going to be increasing. It's not going to be increasing, although yesterday there was news about slightly increasing the numbers that are going out to states and being a little bit more predictable of how much states we're going to get so they can better plan. But it's probably going to be until, at the earliest, I would think the summer, until we have a sense of whether or not that's happening. But we'll get an early read on it, I think, in countries like Israel, that was done a miraculous job of vaccinating their population. And we'll start to see in places like that, how this herd immunity concept is working for real.
Right. So realistically, the fall, something like that?
I think so. I mean, you'd be surprised.
Yes, I know. Yeah.
Welcome to be surprised it was earlier, but I think that's probably the time. And frankly, that would be a good news story because while this is different than influenza, it doesn't seem to have the same seasonality. If we can get control of this before we go inside again, where we're going to be exchanging each other's air, we'll be in much better shape than we are now.
Right. And would your expectation be that folks are going to see the enrollment process getting noticeably better here?
Can it get worse? Get better. I think part of the problem is that this was a lot of people were trying to solve it by themselves. A state would do it based in some ways, or a city would do it. The drugstore chains, Walgreens and CVS, who are part of the story, have their own systems. Hospital systems are doing it, and there's no interchangeability. I think there's some efforts to try to see how that works. I'm always amazed how complicated it is to get electrons to talk to each other and get these different systems to work. I hope there's some efforts to that. Some states have been able to do that, where they have a central system where you go to one place and it makes a reservation for you. There are a lot of people in the private sector, who are trying to help. Who do this well. So maybe the airlines, maybe OpenTable, people who know how to make reservations for their business might be able to apply it to some of those. But I think there's everyone realizes this has to get fixed. It's just too frustrating, and particularly since the population now is people in their 90s can't try to figure out how to use an iPhone and go to 15 different sites to make a reservation.
Right. Okay. There are a lot of detailed questions that have popped up here in the last week or so, and it's some of the logistics. What happens if I get the first shot, cannot get the second one in the 3-week time frame.
So, and as I said, that's the studies were done that way. The interval in the Pfizer vaccine was 21 days. The interval in the Moderna vaccine was 28 days. This is not based on science. It's based on sort of history and what works. I think the reason Pfizer looked at the 21 days was to try to think of how you could become immune as quickly as possible. While there's some immunity after a first dose, it's not clear how long it lasts and how strong it is. So 2 doses are really necessary. I think the bottom line without science, but based on the way other vaccines work, what you don't want is to have too short an interval. You don't want to get your second dose 2 weeks after a first dose if you happen to be able to. If you get it later, that's probably okay. It's a booster dose in a way that will, the immune system has been woken up by the first dose, and you don't lose that impact. So later is okay. CDC is talking about how much later, but you want to make sure that if it's going to be later, you don't fall through the cracks, and you figure out a way to get back for that second dose, and hopefully the supply will be there for you.
Right. So I've got the first shot. How safe am I?
From what?
From my lifestyle habits. No,
I wouldn't. So you might have some immunity. I wouldn't count on it. The study. So that was a surprise, frankly, that you got some immunity from a first dose based on small numbers. I won't give you the slide that shows you the science, but the immune response after the second dose was much stronger than after the first dose. So while it might protect you a little bit, and that's intriguing, it's not a reason to go into a small place to go out to dinner with 50 friends.
Yep. And then you get the second shot. You're not immediately, quote unquote, safe, correct? There's a several week period. Is that accurate?
Well, again, that's sort of standard with vaccines. It's a week, 10 days, 2 weeks afterwards when you watch the immunity kick in. So it's really, and when the studies are done, they really don't even start looking about its impact until at least a week out, or sometimes 2 weeks out.
Yeah. And so here's the one that I've heard a lot, maybe the most commonly asked question about coronavirus. After I've been vaccinated, I've got both shots. Can I still get the virus and carry it and transmit it?
So maybe. And that needs to be determined. So the vaccines, the studies are designed to say, do they help? They keep you out of trouble. That's how they were designed. Do they prevent you from having an infection, going to the hospital, and dying? And that's what the studies show. What the studies don't show, except there were some indications about this in a few places, but not enough to know, is whether or not that keeps you from being absolutely infected, and you could be a carrier, and therefore you still might be able to infect others. And we know with this disease, what's so unusual about it, and I think the biggest surprise was the degree to which people who have no symptoms can spread to others. With influenza, it's when you start coughing is when you start spreading things. This one is breathing is enough. And so what we need to know is whether or not vaccination keeps you from infecting others. It should, because it should keep the infection at bay, and there should be less virus. But that needs to be determined. So that's the most frustrating part of this, is that of what that means in terms of getting back to normal and doing all the things you want to do with others. The vaccines are great at protecting you from getting into trouble, but what they might do to you having an effect on others is still to be determined.
Yeah, and this, in our preparations, this was one of the main takeaways. Darren, have you got that slide? That was one of the main takeaways, that even getting vaccinated is not enough. This would be number 3. Yeah, we're all gonna need to continue to. I'm sorry, number 2. We're all gonna need to continue to act carefully even after vaccinating, because the science, as you just mentioned, Bruce, is telling us that it'll protect us, but may not protect the people that are around us. So that's an important takeaway for all of us. Don't expect, the need to wear masks and socially distance and wash your hands. Don't expect that to go away after you get vaccinated. Thanks, Darren.
And again, that's where the immunity, this herd immunity, the immunity in the population at large will make a huge difference, because that's the case. If there's a virus that has potential to be transmitted, it doesn't have any place to go. So I think that's where it's your immunity coupled with those around you.
Yes. The questions are piling up here from the audience, Bruce. So I'm gonna ask you just a couple more. We want to make sure to leave time for you to address what's on the audience's mind. What if I've already had the virus? Should I get the vaccine?
That's a great question. So if you've had the virus and you've survived, you should have immunity in the way that works with many of these diseases. What we don't know is how good that immunity is. Frankly, I think that we're learning a lot from it. And what the indicator for that is, have people been reinfected? And there have been relatively few people who have, of all the millions of cases, relatively few documented cases of people who have had a second COVID infection after for sure having a first infection. So that tells me that you get some immunity from the disease. And the longer we go, the longer we'll see how long that, quote, natural immunity is protecting us. But don't know how long it lasts. Other coronaviruses, sometimes the immunity is relatively short, like colds are coronaviruses, and that the immunity you get from them is relatively short. Others, like from SARS, what we experienced 10 years ago, is another coronavirus, that immunity would last a year or two. So we'll have to see. But back to your question, I think the answer is yes. And there's and one of the recommendations of CDC is that you don't have to get vaccinated until 90 days afterwards. I think in part that's really reflecting that you have some immunity and maybe somebody else needs to get a vaccine, so you're relatively protected. But there's no reason not to get a vaccine when it's available, even if you've had COVID in the past.
I assume those that have had the virus are going to be pretty low on the list when reservations are being made.
No, they're not. That's not part of the reservation system. That's not. I mean, you won't get put in the back of the line because you've had COVID in the past. But the point is that if you're interested in getting vaccinated, it's worth getting on the list, and having had COVID in the past shouldn't preclude you from doing it.
Okay. You mentioned at the very top, and I know this is a very new development and there may not be a ton of facts that you can share, but the mutant strains, the UK strain, and then the various other strains that are starting to appear. I know this is a little worrisome. How do you think it's impacting the vaccine rollout and where we are in the entire vaccination program?
So the science first and then the rollout part second. So early on, one of the things that people talked a lot about was how this virus seemed to be much more stable than a cousin, influenza. They're similar in the same family. Influenza is mutating all the time, which is why, in part, we have to get a new flu vaccine each year because the virus is changing. This one early on thought, well, the genome is much more stable. We're going to see some of this, but not too much. Well, it probably shouldn't have surprised people that, in fact, this would happen. And if you take a hard look at the genomic surveillance, this was going on, and only now do we see that this is having some impact on disease spread. So this is why the title of your session about what you need to know. It's what you need to know now, because a few weeks ago, what it looked like was that we were, despite the fact that some of these strains seem to be much more contagious, they're a lot stickier, and therefore were responsible for increasing the number of people who are sick. Early on, it didn't look like it was changing the clinical syndrome. People weren't sicker because of it. And it also seemed that the immunity was the target it was providing was similar enough that the vaccine should be fine. It looks like some of these strains might have the ability to not totally evade the immune system, but maybe somewhat. And so what that means, it doesn't mean the vaccines are no good. it might mean that the effectiveness might be a little bit lower. But what's happening then is in the background, and it's not a surprise, is that the companies and the governments and the researchers are now trying to think about what if we needed to make an adjustment to the vaccine, how would we do it? And the likelihood is that there would be, you would make another spike protein, which was called, and include that in the vaccine going forward. That doesn't negate any immunity you've had previously if you've been vaccinated or if you've been sick. But I think it tells us that we're going to have to pay attention to this globally. We're going to need to know where these strains are, how much they're circulating, and to make the adjustments in the vaccine to try to get in front of those.
Yes, I'm sure we'll be hearing a lot more about that in the coming months. Okay, I think what we should do, we have about 25 minutes left. I think what we should do is turn our attention to the markets for a minute while Bruce is assessing the questions that are coming from the audience. And we will come back and make sure we leave at least 15 minutes so that Bruce can address your questions. So if you have not yet submitted a question, please do so. And then Darren, maybe if you could show the first investment slide here. We've had a lot of questions about how this impacts my portfolio. Buy the rumors, sell the news. This is an old-time Wall Street saying. It basically recognizes the fact that the financial markets really are a collection of thousands of investors all looking forward 12 to 18 months, trying to assess what a particular company's profits are going to be down the road, or what a certain sector is going to be. So you may have noted that the day the Pfizer vaccine was announced, the markets exploded upward. Why? It wasn't because the economy improved dramatically that day, and it certainly wasn't because the COVID results improved markedly that day. No, it was because investors' expectations of where we were going to be 12 to 18 months from now had changed as a result of the Pfizer news. So the bottom line here is that the good news, the good economic news from the vaccine rollout is very likely getting priced into the markets today and has been getting priced over the last few months. This slide shows historically what has happened to the Dow Jones average in the wake of long-awaited good news. This is Armistice Day on World War I, VE Day, VJ Day, the day that the Salk polio vaccine came out. And in every case, the market was down the day of the announcement, the next week, the next month, even the next quarter. So in the wake of long-awaited good news, the markets did poorly following the announcement. And so that's the point. We've had clients ask us, when we get herd immunity, that'd be a good time to really get in the market, add some cash, raise risk. And our position is that the day herd immunity is announced, we may be looking about reducing risk, not adding to it. So that's an important point. We are in the rumor phase of the vaccine rollout and its impact in the stock market. So that's point number one. Point number two is what we call in our hallways the bifurcated market. Earlier this year, we had a lot of questions about how could the market be doing so well in light of so much unemployment and so much pain. COVID is unique in my lifetime in terms of its impact on the markets, and that it created huge winners. Think Netflix, Amazon, Grubhub, Zoom Media. These are all companies whose financial fortunes were dramatically improved as a result of COVID. And while COVID was doing that, it was generating massive losers as well. Oil and gas companies, as we all drove our cars less. The obvious cruise lines, hotels. So what's happening is the market has, the COVID virus has created huge winners and huge losers at the same time. So the question of why the market did so well last year, this bifurcated market really had an impact. There were 5 of the largest stocks in the S&P 500. You know their names, the FANG stocks: Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Google, Netflix. Throw Microsoft in there. Those 6 stocks went up an average of 60+% last year, 60+%. The other 490 plus stocks in the S&P 500 were up 3%. So the answer is not that the market did great, it's that the winners did well enough to carry the whole market. Thankfully, most of the people on this call had substantial representation in those winners last year, and so you participated in the market rally. This chart right here shows what's been happening since the vaccine rollout news really improved. Believe it or not, there's a new exchange traded fund featuring work from home stocks. It's by the company Direction, I think is how you pronounce it. So since they are the blue line, and since the rollout, that ETF is up only 2.88%. The orange line is a value index. This index holds many of the COVID losers. And they are up 10%. So the definition of this is a sector rotation. What's happening since the vaccine news really came out is a rotation from the tech stocks and the work from home stocks that had done so well in most of 2020 to the back to normal stocks, as we call them. And this is something that could very well persist, and it needs to be thought about in the portfolio. We have been putting a lot of attention into making sure you have enough back to normal stocks in your portfolio as well. So that's point number 2. Point number 3, Darren, please. Okay, this is a global pandemic. Every human being on the planet is affected. But when you look at economies, it's not affecting all the economies equally. So this chart shows what the estimated 2021 unemployment rate is for a number of companies. That is I guess that's gold or green. And then the blue line is the percentage of the gross domestic product of each country that had to get injected into the economy in order to keep everybody going during COVID. So look at Germany. They had to basically print enough euros, print euros equal to almost 45% of their GDP in order to keep their unemployment rate at 4.2. We don't actually look that bad on this chart. We only printed a few $1 trillion, which is 10.7% of our economy. But you can see our unemployment rate is stubbornly high and likely to remain so. The point of this chart is the right side of it. Look at Singapore, look at China, look at Taiwan, look at South Korea. Much, much better unemployment numbers, much less stimulus that had to be injected into the economy in order to get those unemployment rates low. Most of you who are investment clients of SBSB, you have heard us talking about the international stocks in your portfolio. They've done a little worse than your US in the last few years. We've been talking about how their prospects seem to be improving. And this kind of data is convincing us that that argument's getting stronger in the wake of COVID. So that also is on the minds of your portfolio team, making sure that you've got enough representation in your portfolio in some of these countries that are coming out of COVID a lot better than Europe and the US. Okay, so Darren, maybe we'll just wrap up with takeaways, then we'll turn it over to Bruce and questions. Maybe Bruce's 3 takeaways. You likely won't have a choice about which vaccine you get. Don't fret. They are both effective and safe. There aren't enough differences. So we made that point earlier. Sadly, getting vaccinated doesn't mean you won't have to wear a mask, and it definitely doesn't mean you'll have to socially distance, and it doesn't mean you should host a party for 100 in your apartment, because you, in fact, may not be safe for the people around you. I think Bruce may have, I don't know if you still agree with this one, Bruce. Maybe we shouldn't put the word dramatically in there, huh?
It'll get better.
States are learning from their experiences, and so hopefully we are expecting to see an improvement in the enrollment process and the vaccine distribution. Any other main takeaways before we turn it over to the questions, Bruce?
Well, I think a couple actually. I think the comment about and there was a question in the chat about it as well, about if everybody I know is vaccinated, is it safe to get together? Again, the purpose of the vaccine is to protect you from running into trouble. So if everybody around you has been vaccinated, essentially everyone can say that same thing. So I think it'll be a little bit different when there's more vaccination going on to be able to move some of these things around. These vaccines are very good, but they're not perfect. So I think that keeping some of the social distancing and again, the purpose is not to breathe somebody else's air, and keeping that one in mind. But I think that that'll be different when there's more vaccination. The question is about these variants and the degree to which those might be that might negate that to some degree. If the vaccines aren't as protective against some of these variants, they still might protect you to a high degree, but maybe less so. And so there still may be some risk. So this variant story is really, we're going to hear more and more about it, and we're going to know more and more about it. But I think that's an important piece to watch. Jim, I want to talk a little about it. We've only talked about these 2 vaccines. There are many more in the pipeline. Some are going to come relatively soon. Johnson & Johnson is supposed to make finish their clinical trial analysis any day, and that will work its way to the FDA. So we don't know what that looks like yet, but we'll have to see. And then there are others also in that pipeline. So over the coming months, we're going to see more data, and hopefully there'll be more vaccines, and that'll make things better, but also more confusing. But just sort of anticipating those. But I wonder, Jim, from the market standpoint, everyone was surprised not only how quickly this happened, but how effective these vaccines were. If you were reading about this, the FDA set the bar relatively low, and they said, well, if it's 50% effective, that's good enough to pass standards, because they wanted to have some protection going on. And then we had these 2 that came forward at 95% protection. But we saw earlier this week or last week that Merck, one of the major vaccine the multinational developers, had 2 separate projects going on, and they both failed. Had that happened, if Merck was the first one out of the box, we have a roaring pandemic, hospitals are being filled, Merck says we're bailing, what would that have done to the markets?
It would not have been good, but there are 2 big things driving the markets today. One is that the safe places to put your money are so unattractive. Cash in a money market fund, bond yields have come down. So people what that serves to do is push people into riskier asset classes. So people are looking for reasons to want to own stocks because everything else is so unattractive. But it's a pretty simple formula. The market is a collection of people that have an expectation about the future. And when that expectation doesn't work out, the markets go down. So if we get major snags in the vaccine rollout, as an example, if herd immunity isn't until Christmas of 2022 instead of what we expect now, all that will serve to knock the markets down. So the Merck example would have been viewed very negatively.
Right. And then just one other point. I spent, as you said at the beginning, Saban does mostly work in lower middle income countries, where there's obviously a different set of issues there about equity of vaccine overall. And this is a huge global issue, is how much vaccine is going to be distributed elsewhere and how quickly. But it does still highlight that, as the globalists say, infection anywhere is infection everywhere. So it's a question of how freely we can travel, implications for travel and trade. So I think it's going to be, on that side of it, it'll be a while until there is enough immunity globally to make the world a safer place. But for a while, there will still be more than pockets where this is going to be still going on.
Yeah, and the have-nots, the poorest countries, will probably end up having the most problem getting access to vaccines, et cetera.
There's an effort going on for that. So, but that's just to highlight that issue for a second. So, how do you want me to take some of the questions now, or are there others?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So I commented about the other, there are many more vaccines in the pipeline. Johnson & Johnson is the first one up. AstraZeneca has a partnership with the people who actually invented this technology. That was actually that's being discussed today with the CDC. Unclear when that one may surface. Novartis is another one that's being supported by what used to be called Warp Speed. I don't know, it doesn't have a new name yet. And that's a different technology, but again, the early clinical trials look promising. So that, again, there'll be more of these coming forward. There were a number of questions about safety, and I just want to, I touched those in the beginning, but I know that's a concern for a lot of people. I think because there's so much vaccination now, not just in the United States, but globally, it's giving us a pretty good read on the safety profile of the vaccines. Again, that's short term, but now increasingly we're going to be able to evaluate the safety profile of the vaccines in the short term. And the majority of issues come up with vaccines come up in the first couple of months, usually shorter than that, but in the first couple of months. There's always a question about long-term safety. What do you know about that? And again, we'll have to see. Biologically, there's not a reason that could be an issue. Probably important to point out, people often, and there's a lot of the people who are fueling some of the misinformation are trying to tell people that the mRNA will change your genes, and it won't. The way that works, so it's actually, let me spend a second. The mRNA part, you've heard all about these unbelievable freezers, because this is a very unstable molecule, and it's got to be wrapped in this lipid to stabilize it to give to you. That then finds its way into your cell, and that's the point. It gets there and then instructs your cell into creating what becomes an immune response. And then because it's so fragile, it goes away. So it doesn't get anywhere near the DNA, but that's something that, because people aren't sure that they remember their biology, and there is an active misinformation and disinformation campaign to scare people about that. That's the one thing that people have been talking about and worried about. Is this changing my genes going down the road, and what the implications that could be? The short answer to that is no. But the longer answer is that these are new vaccines on new platforms, and we have to put systems in place, because there may be something that's at a level of 1 in a million or less than that didn't come up in clinical trials, and we have to continue to look for those.
Right.
There was a question about when a season ticket holder can go back to the Wizards, to basketball. I'm not a season ticket holder, so that's not. but honestly, I think that couples with the population immunity. You watch to see, now you're watching the Super Bowl is gonna, what's their plan? They're gonna allow vaccinated healthcare workers to come, because they want to reward them and have somebody in the fans beside pieces of cardboard. But I think it's going to be, sadly, for a basketball season ticket holder, it's going to be until, I think we talked about before, the fall, until we know that it's safer to think about getting on a subway or a metro and going to a baseball game. What else?
I assume it'll be like we are today. Some states will be more lenient on it than others.
Yeah, I guess, but what makes a state lenient is a lot of different things. So maybe we'll stay away from that. How best to do this.
Bruce, we've got a question here. There's a lot of questions coming in from clients and guests. It's talking about masks. There's a lot of talk of availability of masks, and now the discussion around wearing 2 masks. I suppose the question is the efficacy of the vaccines. If you've both got vaccines, there's a new discussion about wearing 2 masks. Can you reiterate the importance of wearing masks to us a little bit?
I think that might have been a different conversation if it weren't for these mutant strains. I mean, I think that that one lights up in Minnesota doesn't mean that's the only one that's going to be there. And as a friend of mine said to some newspaper, says, stopping travel to keep these strains out is like putting up a chain link fence to keep mosquitoes out. So we're going to see more of these, and there'll be plenty of homegrown ones as well. So I think that we're going to keep seeing mutations. Some of them will matter, and most of them won't. And what I mean by some of them will matter, these are more contagious. They're stickier. And so what that tells me is that there's still a risk and an increased risk of being infected. And while the vaccines are going to help us with the immunity, I think in the near term, I think the message is like as parents tell their kids, now I mean it. So if you've been casually using a mask just to be socially appropriate, I think now you should make sure they fit correctly. And think about that, where you're going, and are you into some place where you think that the air may not be handled so well. I actually asked this question about the CDC earlier today. I don't have a clear answer. My suspicion is that there'll be new guidance about mask wearing. Many people have used multiple layers. That these are small viruses, and so they're going to get through some of these. But except for these the N95 masks or that are designed to at least keep these particles out. But there's a leaning towards more layers. People putting filters in there to try to prevent that. Again, it's not perfect, but it's a barrier that could help.
Thanks, Bruce. Bruce, you mentioned the development of additional vaccines in the pipeline, AstraZeneca, Johnson & Johnson. There's a lot of question about the preference of a vaccine. Should we be waiting out for a Johnson & Johnson or waiting out for an alternate because it's better?
If these things came in at 30%, then maybe you would think about it differently. I don't see a point in waiting. That again, I think it's with the one exception of the second dose. But again, even with that, if you have a second dose that's not the same company as the first dose, I think I wouldn't hesitate to take it myself. But I don't think there's nothing about these that we should be waiting for. The one we'll see how this gets, what the data is and how it gets messaged. The thing that's the most attractive about the Johnson & Johnson as a concept is the idea that it could be a single dose rather than 2 doses. Because it makes life infinitely simpler from a logistical standpoint. What I don't know is whether or not, because of that, there might be a recommendation to use that in populations that have a harder time getting a second dose. So we'll see where that goes, but I think that there might be considerations about how vaccines, this one from a feasibility standpoint, might be better for different populations.
Thanks, Bruce. And we've got one last question that kind of summarizes the collectiveness of the questions, is these new variants that you were talking about. If somebody's been vaccinated, with the Pfizer vaccine, for example, should they be then concerned about the new variant strain? And can you talk to us just on closing remarks about these new variants and how worried we should be?
Yeah, I think that, the vaccines are remarkable for the immunity they provide. It's likely that the immunity we see in them in the high 90s might be less. And therefore, if these variants become the common one, and it's sort of a Darwinian process that they are better at this and they're going to get more people infected. And the projections are that some of these variants will be the most common in the population. Then we have 2 things going on. We have less immunity so that an individual still might become infected and still might get sick. The hope is that they wouldn't get as sick and it prevents you from more serious things. And that's generally how vaccines work, but it's still the potential of being infected. So I think that if you've been vaccinated or if you had prior disease, you're at increased risk of being infected by the variant than you might have been if it weren't a variant. And that will probably require some adjustment to the vaccines. There's a lot of experience with this with influenza. They do this every year to make a new flu vaccine. And I think the question is how long it would take to make that switch, to start developing the next generation vaccine of the ones we already have. My guess is it would be a couple of months for the whole process to work out to make sure that that would be the case. The FDA's got lots of experience with flu vaccines, not as much with this, so they think they would want to take a hard look at the data from the companies to do that. So I think that will be another thing going forward. But I think that, and then the related piece, and I'll stop there, is this is a virus that we're going to be living with. It's not going to go away. It's not going to be eradicated like smallpox or polio, and we're going to have to figure out how to do that. The more immunity there is, the better. But again, that has implications for travel. But I think that we're going to have to get used to that and make whatever either behavioral adjustments going forward, including, not only how we go out to dinner, but have implications for the workplace and all kinds of things. And probably like flu, we're going to be experienced where periodically you may need to get a booster, either because the immunity you have before is worn off, or because the virus is different enough, you have to tune up your immune system to cover it.
So we could very well be looking at annual COVID shots, much like annual flu shots, huh?
I think there's going to be, I think it's likely that there'll be some repeat vaccination, whether it's annual or what the interval is, we'll have to see. But I think that's going to be, I think that's going to be part of our new normal.
Okay, our hour is up. Thank you again, Bruce. So nice to talk to somebody that actually knows what they're talking about on this topic. For the audience, this will be available. This has been recorded. I believe it will be on our YouTube channel. It will also, if you have a friend that you want to have access to this webinar, just reach out to your SBSB team and ask them how you can get it. But thank you, Dr. Gellin. Thank you to the audience, and we'll talk to you soon.